Now let's take a look at some of the nuts and bolts of risk oversight and the process itself of addressing risk for an organization. There are some terms on your screen right now that I mentioned earlier, and I want to elaborate on them here just a bit. Identification, assessment, prioritization, and response. When we're talking about risk in an organization, this is the sequence with which an organization addresses risk. First, you identify the risks, then you assess the risk. In other words, you're going to look at the magnitude of the risk. Then you're going to determine which risks need our attention first. What is the order in which we should address the risks? And then you develop appropriate responses to the risks with appropriate priority order. And that's the idea. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk first here now about identifying the key risk areas. John, you touched on some of these key risk areas earlier. I want to get just a little more granular about it and look at some of the specific areas in a little more detail. One area that we're seeing, John, relates to corporate structure risk, and particularly this has to do with the fact that in many cases, organizations that were formed decades ago have one legal entity, one corporate entity in which they carry out all of their activities and in which they own all of their assets. Maybe they've got significant property and equipment, often real estate that's worth millions or tens of millions of dollars, and often a significant investment portfolio, and they're holding all of those things in the same legal entity that they use to carry out all of their operations, carry out the activities that generate risk. And others, like their governing documents, their articles, their bylaws, and some of their policy manuals and the like. John, can you talk a little bit about why risks in these areas are important and how an organization might at least begin to address some of those risks?
Absolutely, Mike, and just a reminder to those listening in that we'll cover some of the highlights here, but certainly go into greater depth on future web briefings. But the key issue that Mike was just alluding to in regards to having everything in a single entity poses a risk, because if an organization comes into litigation, one of the aspects is to look at and determine how much is available to anyone who's recovering damages in such a process. In other words, how much is it worth to pursue this litigation? And sometimes, if there's not very much to pursue, a party may not pursue litigation in the first place. And so one common aspect to look at is for organizations to isolate high-risk activities or high-value assets in separate legal entities in order to create what's called a corporate veil or a hedge of protection around such activities or assets. Sometimes this might be a real estate holding company or a foundation in order to provide this protection. This does raise the bar of complexities for an organization to adhere to from an accounting standpoint as well as formalities, and that is that the organization must strictly adhere to this process and have it reviewed by your legal counsel as you're working through this. If you do have such an arrangement, it's important to treat each entity as a unique entity. Otherwise, you run the risk of nullifying the entire isolation process that was gained through the separate corporate entities.